Excellent. Well, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to our webinar to launch our Vancouver Exploratory Retreat on the theme of balancing human and AI reasoning. So the webinar today is really an opportunity for us to share a little bit more about the event, and especially for you to meet our three expert speakers that will be joining us in Vancouver in January. So we have Dr. Delia McCabe, Beth Rudden, and Dave Snowden. So the way that we'll run this session today is we'll do a little bit of an introduction to the event, to the theme, why it is that we've picked this topic, where it's emerged from via Cynefin and beyond. And then each of the Eagles will have an opportunity to introduce themselves and some of the questions or lines of inquiry that they are bringing in around this theme from their different experiences and areas of expertise. We'll have a little bit of dialogue based on that, and then around 20 to 30 minutes at the end for a nice bit of audience Q&A and participation. As I mentioned earlier, for those that you joined a few moments ago, we have a Q&A function on the call today because there's quite high numbers of us. Please also feel free to continue to introduce yourself in the chat and just to pop anything in there as we go along. But first of all, I'll just kick things off with telling you a little bit more about the Vancouver event, what it's all about. The name for this event that we are running is the Cynefin Exploratory. For those of you who are very familiar with our work at the Cynefin Company, this is simply a renaming of an event that we used to call the Retreat. All sorts of reasons for that rename, but namely that, it's a 3-day event where you're engaged and a lot of very active dialogue, sense making, and there's not really that much that's retreat-like about it. So we thought it was a little bit of a misnomer, and we're going to rename this what it is. So we're calling these a Cynefin Exploratory. This will be 3 days in Vancouver at Simon Fraser University. So we'll drop the event link into the chat throughout the call. But it will run on the 20th to the 21st of January. So the way that we run these is in classic Cynefin style. There's a lot of participation. We have 3 expert speakers, but each of you as an audience member will play a really active role in the sense making, in the themes that emerge. And we'll have about a day and a half where we kind of lose ourselves in this dialogue in a full group, but also in smaller groups. So you have that kind of intimate setting to explore some of what you're hearing and also really importantly, draw it back to your context. And then for the remainder of the time when we're together, we will move into more of a kind of action definition space. And we can speak a little bit more to that towards the end of the call. We've been running these events for many years. The last one was in Snowdonia in Wales. The one before that was in Washington, DC. And we're always blessed by having some incredible speakers with us. We try to ensure that we have speakers from quite diverse perspectives so that we can encourage some kind of healthy dialogue and disagreement in the room. And yeah, we're going to be able to kind of meet the 3 speakers today and hear a little bit more about what it is that they're bringing to this space. But before we do that, I'm going to hand over to Anna to share a little bit more on the theme and why it is that we're focusing on this question for this particular event.
Thank you very much, Ellie. And I'm going to take you on a little bit of a historical review, historical hike, if you will, because this is where we start. We're starting with a hike. We're starting in New Zealand when Dave and I were walking through the mountains and wondering what would make a good subject for the next series of then retreat events. And given that we were walking and kind of experiencing all of the implications of that, and that subject that is very close to both of our hearts, we proposed to the rest of the organization that we should do something around human cognition and human cognition as embodied and embedded and extended into the world. So that morphed basically into the relationships and the connections between the mind, the body, and the world, and how they shape one another. How do people act? And AI was a little bit in the back of people's heads when that event started being organized. It was connected in subtle ways. The speakers that were invited to this one, we did not explicitly give them an AI theme, but it did start coming up in their presentations. It did start coming up as a theme. And it started coming up in the reflections of the participants as well. And especially as we were moving towards the end, where people in this space, where it's, generative, creative space, where new products, new methods are created, where people are thinking, what do I take from here and what do I want to work on from here onwards? Something that people started landing on is the reflection that, wait a minute, part of what we have been doing here these 3 days, part of what we have been reflecting on is, in a sense, what it is to be human, what it is to reason like a human with everything that goes into it. And why does it matter? Why is it important for us to know, for us to be aware of how we reason as a human? And meanwhile, all of this period, and when the whole retreat theme was just a kernel of suspicion in our minds, the world has been moving very, very fast. All of the examples that you see here, I grabbed those within a couple of hours in a news cycle. So all of those things are 2 or 3 hours apart in when they turned up in my newsfeed. AI was everywhere, was in everyone's mind. And there is so much engagement with it, so much change, so much transformation around it. It's such a powerful force that the need to interrogate it much more explicitly in relation to what humans can do, what humans could do, and what humans should do in terms of the reasoning, was just becoming ever more present and important. And I don't know, I remember the story. It's an old Sufi story. I don't know if some of you have heard it. The Water of Madness, where a prophet warned the people that on a certain day, all water in the world would stop running. And then the water would start running again, but it would be mud water. Anyone who drink it would go crazy. And one person listened to the prophet and they hid a safe supply of water before the waters turned. And when the day came for the prophecy, the waters indeed changed and everybody drank the mud water. And the person who had his own reserves, he could see still that everyone around them had gone mad. He went around trying to make reason, but they could not even remember what had happened before. So eventually, after a few days of trying to reason with everybody, he just went back into his storage in his cave and threw away everything, and he drank the crazy water himself. And I'm not trying to lead to any very particular insight, but for some reason, this story has been in my mind a lot lately. And I'm wondering about the fact that we so often do not even wonder what it is that we are dealing with. And it's really important that we do so. So we have this event to actually consider where is the madness, where is the sanity, and where is the very, very big space in between, and all of the things in our minds and our reasoning. And how to move forward. And it goes far beyond this single event. It goes far beyond 3 days in Vancouver. This is something that a lot of us are probably going to need to take very seriously for months and perhaps years to come. And I can't wait to hear this initial taste that we're going to get now.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Anna. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to hand over to our eagles, who will each have about 5 minutes to introduce themselves and to share the particular questions that that are alive for them as they're kind of coming towards this space. So we're going to start off then, please, with Dr. Delia McCabe. Delia, go for it.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you, Cynefin, and thank you to everyone that's attended. This is an important discussion because there is no control group anywhere. We're all in the experimental group. And whenever that is the case, we're left with, the comparison problem. And as Anna so beautifully shared with that Sufi story, if you don't have a comparison group, then you are completely and absolutely immersed in the experiment yourself. So my background is I was a clinical psychologist. Clinical psychology didn't answer important questions for me, so I became a neuroscientist. I wanted to know what was happening at the neuronal level, how that led to behavior change, how that led to people being able to respond to their environment in more positive ways. And the one thing we do know for sure about the human brain, it does not have a filter to use to ascertain whether what it's being exposed to is going to serve it in the short term or the long term. It simply responds to the environment it's exposed to. And that is one of the challenges and the blessings of neuroplasticity, considering that this tissue between our ears is the most sophisticated and sensitive tissue that we have discovered in the known universe. So it simply responds according to what it's exposed to. There's no judgment in relation to that. And that is something that I consider a very important aspect of this exposure to artificial intelligence or LLMs, or sometimes I think of it as an alien form of intelligence. Because if we are exposed to aspects of the world and our brain is changing accordingly, as I said, there is no control group to go back to and say, well, this didn't really work, and how do we go back? It is very hard to rewire neuronal habits. In fact, we never ever overwrite a neural habit. We simply have to form a new neural connection. So that's the one thing that I'm grappling with a lot and that I speak to people a lot about. The second thing that's important to keep in mind is that there are other things in our environment that impact our neuroplasticity, this amazing capacity that the brain has to change shape. And some of those variables lead to what I call enacting the dark side of neuroplasticity, the side of neuroplasticity we don't discuss in a lot of detail, but which also needs to be addressed in relation to this new world that we are now immersing ourselves in. The third thing that I think needs to be discussed, and this brings me back to that beautiful image, Anna, that you shared at the beginning of your slideshow, of Dave going on that hike. One of the things that we don't know a lot about, and I think we need to investigate this in a lot more detail and consider a number of the factors related to this, is that we are embodied beings. We already know that we don't make decisions entirely with our rational mind. That, the book Descartes' Error was Antonio Damasio's argument against the brain and body divide theorists. We know that we need a body to make a decision. And how are we responding to a disembodied model that is trying to speak and articulate its summaries in an embodied way while we are embodied? Are we good at seeing the difference? We have already seen, I'm sure most of you have seen news items where people have mistaken this model that they're speaking to as having feelings and emotions. We know that there are also young people that consider some of these models to be friends and confidants. So we know that this embodiedness of us as humans and everything that it contains, this embodiment, is going to impact how we use these models and how we perceive them. And, when organizations look at how they're using these models, they need to keep this in mind, although it's generally very low on the list of things that they consider. But we need to understand, when do people gravitate to these models? What time of the day? How do they use them in a way that is maybe a reflection of where they are in terms of their embodied state? So these are things I'm grappling with, and these are questions that we're going to be diving deeper into in Vancouver, because, as I say to people regularly, at some point we are likely to become the fish in water that doesn't know what water is anymore. And how does that, how do we anticipate that? How do we work with that in this world that is changing irrevocably? Thank you.
Fantastic, Delia. Thank you so, so much. Okay, brilliant. So we'll pass over then to Beth to introduce yourself and share what's alive for you around this at this moment. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Beth Redden, and I'm the current co-founder and CEO of Bast AI. And this is a company that I opened in October of 2022 after graduating from a pretty storied career at IBM. I was a distinguished engineer. I was the chief data officer of our $34 billion managed services division. I got to perform one of the largest workforce transformations where we got 23,000 human beings to upskill and reskill themselves by looking at people in 100 different dimensions and recognizing that our data systems that labeled people had no concept of dimensionality of what that human being could do and think and see and feel and be able to be participant within a company that they already had the culture of it. What my background is archaeology. And so prior to, I won the lottery, I had parents who told me to go to school for what I loved, and I did. And I spent a year in Italy digging in the dirt and really understanding or trying to understand the Etruscan culture, which was pre-Roman, and we knew nothing. We know nothing. And it took me almost 20 years to kind of have this like settle into my brain. But this idea of history is really a representation of what that human being who is writing the history. You know, everybody says the victors win, you know, the victors always win. But technically, I think it's the archaeologists that tell the story, and amateur revisionists have nothing on archaeologists. But I would say that this concept that I grew up with, especially as an anthropologist, and for the record, I had programming skills, which was another gift from my parents. So I entered into the world of industry as a programmer, as an information scientist, as an engineer, and that gave me such a different perspective because I walked into IBM and I would write the word human and they're like, you can't use that word. It's cost, it's FTE, it's, you know, it's resource. And that was so jarring to me because I'm like, this is dehumanization. This is not a good thing. You know, we social scientists understand that this is not how we need to be seeing and perceiving human beings. And when I opened Bast, it was because I have been screaming from the rooftop that there is a different way to do artificial intelligence using natural language understanding by grounding context to models. And the model like frame that we use are ontologies. And this dates back to the beginning of the World Wide Web and the W3C standards. So we can inherit a huge amount of code and a standard that is already proliferated. And an ontology is also a branch of philosophy that studies the nature of your reality based on the language you use. So we can make this explicit. And I'm like, what a tool, like what a gift to be able to see how somebody is looking at their reality. And when I was in IBM and we were educating a market in 2015, 2016 on what responsible, explainable AI that used only the amount of compute that it needed in order to source an answer for the application of a business problem, like we saw the world just shift, where in 2012, we started the data science profession. And it was me, a statistician and a mathematician. And we watched all of these humans shoving large amounts of data into these statistical models to statistically brute force answers with no understanding of the variance or standard deviation of those data sets. And then that just really got intense when Andrew Ng said, hey, we can use a graphical processing unit to be able to operate machine learning 100 times faster. And we lost the thread. No one is looking at the data anymore. And I'm like, we have a different way to do things. We have an alternative to black box AI. And in fact, we have an alternative that is 70% less the compute that creates these data centers that are hungry and thirsty for the 3 to 5 million gallons of water that takes these data centers to be able to perform daily. With that, I will tell you all about explainable AI, but I will tell you also that it is always the aspect of ourselves that we have to understand. And we have this amazing tool with artificial intelligence that, with the correct cognitive scaffolding, with ontologies and knowledge graphs and proper care and handling of the data that you put in, you can absolutely change the understanding of how a human being can utilize AI as a partner and not get to this identity coupling and misappropriation of the personification and the things that are part of our Paleolithic body. And I'm so excited to learn from Dr. Delia and Dave Snowden.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Beth and Delia. So over to you, Dave, 5 minutes to introduce yourself and what it's like for you in this at this moment in time.
Okay, so Dave Snowden, I think I know a lot of people here. It's a pleasure to be working with Beth and Delia. I met both of them at conferences and we ended up bonding. Oh my God, somebody else understands this stuff. So that was always good news, right? Couple of things. I'm just actually writing a blog post about this program, and one of the comparisons I'm making is a lot of the sort of tech bro attitude to AI inherits from the sort of southern United States Protestant concept of the rapture. What we've been offered is a utopia where nobody can tell us what the utopia is, but we're just meant to trust people on the journey towards it. And I think that has major implications. I mean, the other problem I have, and this is possibly a slight disagreement with Beth, is that fundamentally part of the problem is people misinterpreted ontology to mean language and text, which is not what it means in philosophy, right? So philosophers get permanently indignant about the way the IT profession took a perfectly useful word and used it as an alternative for taxonomy because they thought taxonomy was unfashionable, right? So I'm being slightly pejorative here. But one of the dangers we saw in knowledge management, which is where I came from, is it started to believe that the only value in knowledge was information, and the only type of information which was valid was text. And we're seeing the same replication at the moment in AI. I had an encounter with somebody this morning who told me basically the Cynefin framework wasn't needed anymore because now with AI, which had superhuman capability, we had got rid of all uncertainty. And this guy is advising board level, right? He hasn't yet responded to my response. I intend to play with that one for a bit if I can, right? But you have got this sort of messianic, sort of quasi-religious aspect to it, which is really worrying. And it's a belief that AI will, you know, it's almost like fatalism, like we can't solve global warming, so AI will magically do it for us. Yeah? So also from a knowledge management background, I mean, I worked in AI in the early days. I remember writing programs in Prolog to try and replace doctors. And there were two old options on this. And yes, Beth, I know Smalltalk was better, but basically, there were two directions. Some of us realized we couldn't replace doctors with code, and other people thought, well, we just need more code and we can do it better. So I went down the first of those routes. And that's still part of what we're working on, right? I think we're interested in this program in several key things, all right? So one is companies are going down an A route. It's now the fashion route, right? The danger is that they could lose people whose skills they need later, and they won't be able to re-employ them because it's not like buying a database, it's buying experience. So I'm interested in, for example, how do we map the skills that people have got which AI can potentially replace, or rather the skills that the company isn't currently using? So can we identify skills which are human skills, which could be used in this hybrid type world that we're thinking about, and mapping that? Mapping the dependency of humans on basically the dependency of the company on abductive reasoning. You know, AI thinks inductively, humans think abductively. AI does abductive only by accident. So we evolved to make decisions in complex ways and to use multiple sensory data. We know, for example, scent has a lot to do with trust. We know there's senses we don't yet fully understand in things we take account. We're a lot more than text orientated, right, in that sense. And there are tasks that human beings have to do for extended periods if they're able to exercise judgment over what AI is doing well or badly. So even if AI could do them well in the short term, it damages human potential long term. So that's another area of interest here, right? And also the potential damage is high, all right? So we already got examples of suicide, of AI-induced suicide. That's going to become more extreme as we go down the level, because there's no natural inhibition within the system. And we also need to start to think much more seriously about some of the issues around how we train these things. So for those who don't know, SenseMaker was originally designed to produce epistemically balanced training data sets, and that was 25 years ago. And one of the things that I think the Chinese are ahead of us on this is that basically you can't sell software without declaring your training data. At least that's the principle. It's more honored in the breach than the observance. But I actually don't think any AI should be used if you don't understand what it's been trained on, because that's part of its inhibition. Yeah, and it's reinforcing, in effect, past practice on that level. So we want to extend that capability. And also bring back in some of the other aspects of AIs. I mean, neural networks are still hugely powerful. Using genetic algorithms to choose between neural networks was something we did a lot of. Starting to understand that there's far more to hybrid systems, than we understand. And this over-focus on text is quite scary. And I read a book, or I didn't read a book, I refused to buy it at the MIT bookshop years ago, and it basically said, correlation is causation. And there's a huge amount of people who now think this is the case. If we can just have enough algorithms and enough data, we can magically solve all the problems of the universe. So those are the things I want to address, and also bring into what is going to be a year-long research program with other events. Vancouver will actually trigger this. Yeah.
We leave after 6, the alarm will go off.
Okay. We have a crisis here. If I don't leave now, the alarm is going to go off in the room, so I'll come back on, right? Leave it at that point.
This feels like an auspicious moment, maybe.
They
Okay.
didn't tell us about this, all right? Never mind. Okay.
There's only so much predictability the housekeeping can do. Okay, brilliant. So by now you've probably got a bit of a sense of the kind of diversity of speakers that we like to bring in and what that can give in terms of maybe challenging some of our assumptions, drawing light to some of the definitions we use and how we might want to bring a little bit of nuance into that space in terms of what that can give us. So I'm just going to kind of open out now to Delia and Beth, and then Dave when he comes back through, and Anna, if there's anything you want to throw in as well, to share your kind of responses based on what the others have shared and any kind of new questions that might be emerging. So we'll have maybe about 10 minutes of this, and then we'll open up to Q&A.
One thing I'd love to, Dave is absolutely right about my complete appropriation of the word ontology for knowledge graphs. What I'd love to do is like kind of bring it down and give an example of this. And Delia, I am super interested in your understanding too, because what we are doing is we are grounding like high quality medical protocols. So anybody who has a need to be able to carry high quality primary sources like hospitals in understanding diagnosis and prognosis, using the explainability to say you were just diagnosed with POTS, but statistically, there is no human being in the sample of any of the studies that understand the prognosis of what that means for you personally. And having that understanding of as a human being to break down the statistical understanding to make sure that the human being says, well, wait a second, if there's nobody in any of these studies, how does this prognosis relate to me personally? And how does that change how I'm going to interact with this diagnosis or this label? And then even more so with more of the mental health labels and being able to understand the, the psychosomatic or the placebo effect in a way that we've never been able to before. And I'm super curious, Dr. Delia, what you think about that and having that level of explainability for the human being to be able to ascertain their own understanding of their own diagnosis.
That's an interesting question, Beth. I've never thought about it in precisely those terms before. I think this lends itself to how that person interprets it and the language that is used. And so what concerns me about the people that are involved in developing these models, Dave used the word, kind of like a religious overtone in relation to we're going to solve all the problems. As an aside, my son said to me a while ago, he said, all this AI stuff is really fantastic and it can churn data and it can give us all this information. He said, but if it was so wonderful, it wouldn't just be telling us about cancer, it would be curing it. And I think that brings me to the point of saying, I'm using the word psychographic as a placeholder at the moment for this concept of a particular mind that has developed these models, this mind that sees the world in a particular way and experiences reality in a particular way. And so then that goes into the model. And how does that interpretation that those minds have now taken, how does that impact how we look at that information and how we perceive that information? That I think is this gray area, because a lot of people that are involved with this development don't think the way many other people think. And so we have this mismatch. I don't know if that answers your question, but
it's one of the things that I'm very interested in is the way that people want to receive information. And I am dealing with, very high, like life-changing diagnostics, like in that sense. And when people are wanting to receive information, even in their own language, in their native language, if they don't have English as their first language, why and how that changes the information, the quality of the information when it's delivered in the language that they speak. And these are things that we can do to a certain extent. But, to Dave's point, I do not want to necessarily deliver information that doesn't have a full understanding of the grounding and context of that information. So that's the inspection that we have to do that I still see missing from a lot of the foundational models, that we have no understanding of what those data sets are in reference to how they might use translation, which also is like fraught with all of these different things that can be misappropriated and misunderstood.
Absolutely. I'll use another example. Our daughter is a medical doctor, and she became a medical doctor at a fairly young age. And a couple of years ago, she spoke to us about the path she wanted to take. And this speaks to the way age and experience shifts the way doctors think and how they deal with patients. So she was doing an oncology rotation, and she said she wants to be an oncologist because the older doctors in the hospital treated people with a level of callousness that she felt was terrible. And she thought that being a younger doctor and being more care orientated for how this person felt with this diagnosis, being handed over to them, was something that she felt very drawn to doing that. And so we ended up having a discussion about how age impacts how doctors feel about working with their patients and how they deliver news, because maybe it's a way for them to protect themselves from the trauma that they are now imposing on their patients with this terrible diagnosis. So I don't know how that lends itself into training a model and how the person looking at this data, the person that is reading the data and having to hand over that diagnosis, will do it in a particular way that they have become accustomed to doing because of their life experience. So a younger practitioner would do it differently to an older practitioner. Is there any way to make this standardized so the care endpoint is experienced positively by the person that is getting this information? how do we train that model? How do we get the person to deliver that information using the model, not to have that information, that diagnosis overridden by their experience?
That brings in one of the things that we've also been looking at. So if you look at, say, end-of-life decisions for children, the medical profession, regardless of age, become more medical language because it immunizes themselves from the emotional content.
Correct.
Whereas the parents are becoming more emotional. So one of the things we've been starting to look at is shifting from individuals to collective decisions. So can we actually get groups of different people in different contexts and different backgrounds and ritualize their decision capability? Because that links more with the way we evolve to make decisions, which not as isolated individuals. Then you can have an AI agent as one of the roles within that group. And people
Yes,
may or may not know what it is. So you can start to create those combinations in which human judgment is interacting with non-human judgment.
yes, because then you're using distributed cognition in a different way.
Yeah.
One of the challenges that we have now working with AI is that our cognition is bound, and now we're joining it with AI, and it doesn't mean that it's not bound. It's still very much bound, but in a different way. So what you're suggesting, Dave, is that we now distribute that cognition and we get AI to be one of the parties, not the 50% or the 100% of the parties.
And one of the things I'm really concerned about is, I mean, a lot of us forecast, back 20 years ago, I still remember at a big conference in Washington, and somebody asked myself and Poindexter, what was our worry about AI? And we said, nobody's focused on the training data sets. And nobody's focused on what will happen to people as a result of use. So that was 20 years ago we said that. And the only real difference now is you've got faster data capture, more algorithms. Now, I think, one of the things we've got to start to look at very consciously is the mental decline, which we forecast would happen over years, is actually happening in weeks. And that has permanent impact, right?
Yeah.
So how do we start to manage around that? Because that's not something we could recover from, right?
Well, Dr. Delia could totally. I think that the brain is an incredibly adaptive organism or organ, like, and it's part of and I think that you are so correct about the collective, and if that collective has the same level of training, and just full stop, all AI should augment people no matter what. There's no reason for an AI to make a diagnostic decision. So I realized I needed to put that down as that is a law in my world. But what struck me when you said that was the same thing on why we wanted to create a data science profession, is we wanted to train the people to understand the data that they were putting into the models. And of course, they're like, well, that's a data engineer's job. But did you know in the United States that every single doctor has to do a pediatric rotation, but there are only 3 hospitals in the entire United States, or maybe 4, that require a doctor to do a geriatric rotation? And so when we're training human beings, we're not even giving them the right variance. And so if you look at that group of human beings as its own agent with its own sense making, we need to have the training of those human beings be as variant as is necessary to create that sense making as the collective, and with AI as one part of that collective.
And that's a really important point, because one of the things I've seen in 2 projects is the way that human behavior changes based on the AI.
Yes.
So one of the projects I did
right.
in the North Sea with the oil companies was, in order to rediscover oil, we had to get rid of the AI. Because if the AI said drill, people drilled, it wasn't their fault. But if they thought there was oil and they drilled and the AI said not, they were in trouble. So by removing AI, we managed oil discovery again. And I think we see the same in the clinical professions. So, for example, what's been happening in the UK now for about 10 years is called NICE guidelines, in which doctors are interacting with computers, which tell them what they should do based on probability distributions, right? And the human judgment between it is crazy. So, when I reversed type 2 diabetes and it was caused by statins, because I had type 2, I had to have stronger statins, even though that would make the type 2 worse. So we ended up with a deal with a doctor by which she prescribed statins. I threw them in the bin and everybody was happy. All right. Now, what you see is people start to regulate because they want things to be in the center of a normal distribution. So what they want is structure and predictability and reliability, and this has been forced on the medical profession guy with government. So human judgment has been destroyed in the process. Now, I think one of the great opportunities we got with the AI thrust is to bring human judgment back onto the agenda. Because it's with process re-engineering and everything else, it's been removed from that agenda some time. And that comes back to this issue about what skills have human beings got that the company isn't using? What are their perspectives? What are their attitudes? What are their next? What are their connections? So how do we restore human judgment and diversity of decision making into this world? And I think that's going to be key as we move forward on this program.
That's a very... Sorry, Anna?
I thought I would interrupt a little bit just to give the audience a chance to get into this great conversation and add some questions. And of course, we encourage people to submit through the Q&A box. There's actually only one question there, which I will ask, slightly paraphrasing, hopefully without, I hope the asker won't mind. But they're asking about philosophy. Do you think that a facility with philosophy basically makes it easier to navigate the domain of AI, while people who do not have that background, even if they are in an academic background or they're serious researchers, that creates challenges for them?
Well, as you know, Anna, I think philosophy beats archaeology any day, but that's another matter, all right? So,
Beth and I will have words with you later.
Yes, I thought
I
you
was
might.
about to say, but Dave, how do you know?
Because I'm a philosopher. But I think when the key, I mean, what we're not teaching, forget philosophy or archaeology, we're not teaching people critical reasoning.
Yeah.
And the trouble is, when we do teach it, then we want to teach it them rather than let them to experience it. Yeah, and I mean, I've had this experience recently, and the modern generation can't separate the content of what they say from their personality. So an understanding of ad hominem is going. So if you criticize somebody's idea, you're held to be criticizing them as a person. So I think there are things we can reintroduce here which are important, right? And the Socratic technique, the ability to argue a position that you don't agree with, which I was trained on from the age of 11, is critical. You know, being trained to be critical is okay, but arguing things you don't believe in and interacting with multiple people in multiple arguments, that develops the brain to the point where you can sense whether something is right or wrong. So I think we need to introduce that capability. And we need the humanities back in place. We need anthropology and philosophy. And the fascinating thing at the moment, I was chatting with somebody in a university, and they said, we can't get employment these days for economics graduates and MBAs, but people are really interested in anthropologists and philosophers because AI is starting to focus people on human judgment and human capability.
I think there's also a psychology, and I want to ask you this directly, Dr. Delia, like the change in psychology where we now have the understand of you know, objective empirical like views. I don't know if it's proof of like the origin of your neurosis is a physioneurosis, and like that connection is so new for us. That was not in the connection between the psychology that we were learning in the 80s and 90s. And now we have all of these tools that we can use to see the brain and to see the physioneurosis. And I'm super curious if that is also part of this, because cognitive sciences is the binding of philosophy, psychology, and computer science.
Great question, Beth. I just want to go back to something that Dave said earlier, which is about critical thinking and how the brain changes and whether this is going to serve us or not. So we have to bring in the discussion about these opportunistic windows of development, you know, from utero, early years of life, and up until about 26, 27 for the male brain, and up until about 23, 24 for the female brain in relation to full brain development. This is prefrontal cortex or executive functioning, as people generally think of it. So the challenge we have just in relation to this critical thinking, which Dave mentioned, is that we need to teach children that there is a difference between emotion and cognition. And this does speak a little bit to answering your question, Beth, which I'll get to in a moment. So when people aren't taught to understand the difference between emotion and cognition, what happens is that they tie something that somebody has said directly to how they feel, not to the concept being discussed. And this is where we have this jarring feeling when we're having a discussion with someone who doesn't understand critical thinking, because they immediately think they feel uncomfortable. There's an emotional response to what this person has said, which is critical of their thought, and they tie the two together. Now, that's a problem. And I had a challenging conversation with someone a while back who told me that cognitive dissonance is bad. And I
What?
said, yeah, and I said,
Oh my God.
I couldn't actually believe that. And this is a person who is said to be, a neuroscientist, and I really grappled with that issue. So cognitive dissonance is not bad. The younger generation may have been led to believe that it is. So critical thinking is fundamental to us learning to work with AI, live with AI, and coexist with AI. If we don't learn to deal with critical thinking and to reintroduce it into the education system, we are in for a terribly rough ride ahead. In answer to your question, Beth, I think one of the things that has happened is that there's been an enormous focus on emotion and what we call emotion, our feelings. And I think that in some ways it has served us, but in many other ways it hasn't served us. And I say this because of the word iatrogenic harm, or the phrase iatrogenic harm. And it's one of the reasons I walked away from being a clinical psychologist, because a therapist brings into the therapeutic relationship their perspective on the world. We can say their philosophy of the world. And if they see the world in a particular way and they have been educated to have a particular perception, they bring that with them into this therapeutic relationship. And I believe that there are a lot of people that have had iatrogenic harm imposed on them. And iatrogenic harm is basically harm that is inflicted on a person unintentionally. And this phrase came into being in hospitals when doctors did surgery, for example, and they left a sponge in the wound and so on. So they introduced something that wasn't there in the beginning, and this has led to a harm for the patient. Now, if this is occurring in therapeutic situations, and I have dealt with many people in the last couple of years who have told me that their child has been negatively impacted by therapy, because now the child's whole world lens is related to how do they feel. And this is not that we need to negate how we feel, but we need to understand that emotion and cognition are not the same thing. And conflating them has led to this confusion, this focus on emotion. And the brain cannot be in a state of learning or a state of flow if it is in a heightened state of negative awareness. So high anxiety levels, chronic stress. The brain does not have the capacity to learn calculus or critical thinking when it senses it's being chased by a tiger.
It's so well stated, and I recognize the full articulation of the understanding that we do not have as any sort of collective wisdom anymore, and the focus on the feelings. It's like, to me, it's always a pendulum that has just swung too far one way that needs to kind of be rectified, so that we can have these, especially in universities and colleges. Like, I see the need to remove speakers that are not aligned with the student population's viewpoint. Like, I mean, there's so many things that I feel like I had not been seeing until lately, where, what does not kill you does make you stronger. There's no fragility in the adaptivity of a human being. And that's where I do think that the best I feel like I can do as a parent is not pass along my trauma to children. They get to have and discover their own, because that is, that is the arrow that we shoot forth from our bodies. But like this has nothing to do with us. And what you said about the psychologist bringing in all of their own perspective, I go back to my training as an ethnologist. I had to write down how I was feeling before I took in somebody's story. And I always thought that was such an interesting thing to try to teach data scientists to be able to say, you need to journal about where you are before you look at the data, before you decide which parts of that data is an edge case. Dave, I'd love for you to do your 2-minute rant on, the bell curve and edges, because like people fundamentally don't get this.
I've just
I'll
been
throw in
doing that,
another
so I won't repeat
question.
it. But
Yeah, good. I was about to interrupt and say I'll throw in another question because the answers are so fascinating. I'm realizing we're taking a lot of time through each one, but I think the discussion is working. So I'll try to. This one is quite complicated, but I'll try to bring the gist across. The question is by John. And he's asking, he's thinking back to what you mentioned, Beth, about the concept of the AI companion. If thought in the context of a distributed cognition framework, then we might imagine that if we draw the way that AI is often used currently with humans, then we have kind of a circle with spokes where each human is interacting with AI essentially on their own, with their own interaction data sets and their own kind of critical reasoning or lack thereof. So how would this look differently or transform into something more positively if it's drawn as a larger circle of discussion that includes more participants as opposed to this kind of one-to-one connection?
I'd answer something, and I think it's granularity counts, and granularity is probably one of the most key concepts in complexity. So what you don't want to do is to anthropomorphize an AI agent, and I think that's one of the problems, and that's why we're getting suicides. But introducing AI agency into distributed systems in which humans are also fragmented and role-based, that gives you the diversity, because then you're making multiple judgments and you may or may not know where they're coming from. So I think there are things we can do here. My worry is also things like language, though, and this is the point Beth made earlier, is that people are translating everything into American English. So the whole of the world is now being mediated through American English, and that's actually quite dangerous. And some of our work at the moment, for example, on SenseMaker is to move to semiotics, not language. So using symbols as a means of interpreting data by people, we think is quite powerful. And that is something which would be difficult for AI to do. But human beings have understood semiotics for our entire history. So it's bringing back, a fascinating thing here. A lot of what we're going to be doing is bringing back old skills and old capabilities that we've forgotten the past 30 or 40 years because of this business process re-engineering and information science focus on text.
Yes, and absolutely, Dave. There's some research that's come out to show that human language is now changing because of the words that AI is using.
I know, it's scary.
Which is very, very sobering. And we also know that when we write, we make sense of our thoughts and figure out what we know and don't know. We consolidate and shift. And if we're doing less writing and more believing, then what happens to human creativity, which is in essence something that is still a bit of a mystery. So I think going back to old ways of doing things, which the brain naturally understands and gravitates to, could be part of the solution to this quandary we find ourselves immersed in.
But I think there's a point somebody made earlier, is the neurodiversity of people involved in AI is very low.
That's what I said, the psychographic.
Really want to bring that up because that is one of the most significant issues we got. There is a complete lack of cultural, neuro, and political diversity in what's going on in AI in the moment. And that's really damaging to humanity.
I think you need to use the word variance, Dave. Diversity is a bad word now.
Okay, sorry.
Variance.
I'll do my best.
No, I think this is exactly what my point was, is that I looked around, all the way back in 2013 going, there are not enough people, and the women who were in the room still are so few and far between. And then we just don't have the variance of neocortexes really creating these systems. I do want to push a little bit on, like, it's not bringing back, to me, when I hear bringing back the old ways of doing things, I tend to reframe that as remixing and taking what we love and making it relevant for today. And human beings like my daughter, who speaks in this incredibly different language than I've ever seen in my life, dead ass, like she uses symbols, semiotics, to indicate whether she likes somebody by taking a Snapchat of a ceiling or a wall or a picture. And I'm like, how do you know that's how you respond? And she's like, she has this entire world of language that human beings are creating that we're not even tapped into. And I wouldn't even know about if I didn't force her to sit down with me and utilize these tools with me so that I can at least understand what she's communicating. So
that is an
yeah.
old skill as well, Beth. I mean, I've done a lot of work in Indigenous communities, and yeah, fundamentally, communication is more than about language. But I think it's not just the things we love from the past. I think it's some of the things we hate which are good for us. Yeah, we were made to learn a poem every week, and I hated it at the time, but now I know the neuroscience of it, and I really benefited from it. So yeah, we've got to think about how we actively, socially, and individually develop human skills at a young enough age, and that concept of brain plasticity is key. If you don't get people before their early 20s, you can have it very difficult to lock in any major change.
I'm going to sneak in one last question because it's incredibly relevant to what Dave said right now. So Tate is asking, is it possible to teach the younger generations at scale on how to think critically when the tech industry is pushing us the other way?
No, it isn't. And this is something I believe in passionately. You can't teach people to be critical. You have to put them in processes by which they learn to be critical. So we did that through debating. We want to do it through mass citizen journalism now. So engaging with people from multiple backgrounds makes you critical because you have to see things from different perspectives. One of the fascinating things for me, working with the CIA, who I was brought up to hate, is they understood more about cultural diversity than any politician I met in my life because they worked in the field. They heard things from multiple perspectives. So I think we need processes through which people learn rather than trying to teach people directly.
I agree 100%, Dave. If you don't enact the things that you're seeing and the way you're perceiving the world and your role in the world and how you're showing up in the world, you will never ever form those neural pathways that are necessary. The challenge we have is that it needs to happen significantly at younger ages than it is at the moment. And, when my children were growing up, my husband and I used to say to them, those frontal lobes, they're just buds. Hold on a second, be patient. And our son used to get beside himself. Don't tell me that. Our daughter said, my brain is more developed than anyone else's of my age. But a couple of years ago, my son said to me, he said, Mom, you know what? I know that my frontal lobes are functioning significantly better than they did before. And I said, tell me why. And he said, because now I can think about the consequences. I can see things from a different perspective. That is a process that happens through a pre-programmed, DNA ordained. We can't negotiate with that process. We need to catch it really young and allow children in age appropriate ways to live the experience where they can say, wow, I didn't see it from that perspective. And that's what we're not doing now.
And we haven't even started on epigenetics yet and the danger of this stuff getting inherited, but we can do that in Vancouver.
We can. Look forward to it.
Speaking of things that we will do in Vancouver, can I ask each of you to give us a closing phrase, literally a phrase, of something that you're looking forward to doing in the event before we say goodbye and send everyone on their merry way?
Well,
And let's start with, we'll go in the same order. So let's start with Delia.
Good question, Anna. I want people to actually sense their bodies as they make a decision and as they feel what is right or wrong. And so I will be using props to enable them to be very much grounded in the reality of their body as they think certain thoughts and as I give them certain prompts. And I'm very much looking forward to that because that's when light bulb moments occur that we can carry forward.
Beth?
I would definitely, I'm going to go back to my, data is an artifact of human experience. What is the data that we are shedding into this world? And then how is that something that we're interacting with when we do interact with an artificial intelligence? How can we, use this alien intelligence inference augmentation that we could learn more about ourselves, and how did we know that we put this data in this place at this time, for what reason?
Thank you. And finally, Dave, any closing words?
I say two things. First of all, Vancouver has the best anthropology museum in the known universe. All right. So we're going to try and incorporate that into this in some way, because that's quite useful and it's in a beautiful part of British Columbia. I think the second thing, and for me, the real reason why we started to change this to exploratory, we linked it with research, is we've always used the retreats to generate new tools and methods. But what I want to do this time is make sure we're generating them in the event and then starting to run them out over the next year. So auditing companies for loss of human capability, understanding how to find out what people know which companies aren't using. It's the development of those pragmatic tools, which I'm looking forward to us ending that session with.
Excellent. So thank you so much to Delia, Beth, and Dave for everything that you've shared today. If any of you in the audience are anything like me, you're leaving with a lot more questions than you started with, which I think is kind of the ideal point that we want to be in at this stage. So thank you so much, everyone, for your questions, for joining us. As I've popped in the chat, we will be sharing the recording for this along with a chat transcript, because there's lots of juiciness in there as well, lots of questions that we didn't manage to get to today, but I know we'll get fed in the longer term. So I've dropped a couple of links in there that will go up in a follow-up email as well. Obviously, a link to the Vancouver event. We're aiming to run another one on this same topic, probably in Dublin in the summer next year too. So do keep an eye out on our pages for more information there. And another link also for anyone who might be interested in taking this into a longer term action research engagement and joining, with a small team or as part of an organization, because we're really wanting to kind of open those opportunities up as much as invite individuals in as well. So a massive thank you to everyone. Please do reach out with any questions, and we hope to see you and speak with you all very soon. Thank you.